we're good to go. Welcome everyone to our Lunch and Learn. My name is Chad Simmons and I'm an ecologist here at the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that MTRI is in and we are sharing this presentation from Guestwood, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kmaq, homeland of the Mi'kmaq people. And we want to thank the Mi'kmaq people for their generosity in sharing their homeland with us. So for anyone who hasn't heard of MTRI before, we are a nonprofit and we are nestled in the heart of Southwest Nova Scotia, just down the road from Ketchimakujik National Park and National Historic Site. And our mission is to promote, sustain, and conserve biodiversity in Guestwick as well as beyond. So today I'm very pleased to introduce Avery Nagy-MacArthur. She is an ornithologist currently working with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and she's about to start a new position with Birds Canada next year. So it's very exciting. And Avery is a lifelong birder. She's started when she was a child, and she's very passionate about sharing her knowledge and passion with everyone around her. So Avery, if you're ready.
Great. Thanks very much, Chad. So as Chad just mentioned today, I get to talk to you about songbirds and shorebirds and everything in between. I'm going to discuss a few different bird-focused citizen science opportunities in Southwest Nova Scotia. So just to give you a quick outline, I'm going to talk about the Christmas bird count, which is coming up probably in an area near you. I'm going to go through different identification tips, which will be helpful if you're new to birding, and hopefully even if you're an experienced birder, you might learn something new. And then I'm going to talk about our most common winter birds in Nova Scotia, as well as some adaptations that birds use to make it through these harsher winter conditions. And as Chad mentioned, I'm currently working on contract for Environment Canada, working on shorebird habitat conservation, and aside from being a lifelong shorebird fanatic. So I wanted to mention the Atlantic Canada Shorebird Survey as well, because that's active within the region and we're constantly looking for new volunteers. So the Christmas bird count is the longest running citizen science project in North America. It has an interesting history. It actually began in 1990, and it was started by the ornithologist Frank Chapman, who was part of the Audubon Society in its early years. There were traditionally Christmas hunts that would take place, during which people would basically kill as many birds as possible. But Frank Chapman decided to initiate the Christmas bird count in hopes of starting a scientific effort. And in 1900, birders at over 25 locations in US and Canada observed everything they could see on Christmas Day. And that tradition in some form has continued through to today. So far to date, there's been over 438 species recorded in Canada. And this data set is one of the biggest data sets available on long-term population trends for so many bird species across a wide geographic area. So it has really valuable research potential. And an interesting study that came out recently actually was able to correlate the winter distribution of 89 different bird species with changes in local climate and land use since the 1930s. And this study used solely Christmas bird count data. So they took that data set and correlated it with local climate variables. And they actually found that climate changes in local climate were strongly correlated with changes in local bird populations for all of these species, and that interestingly, species with very specific habitat requirements were actually more affected by changes in land use over time than by changes in local climate. So for example, grassland species, which have very specific habitat requirements, were more affected by changes in grassland, such as the conversion of native prairie to commercial agriculture over time. So there's a website that you can go online and look at to find out about the Christmas bird count, naturecounts.ca, and there's an interactive map where you can find your local count. Just click on the circle closest to you, and you'll be able to find the information of your local count compiler, which is usually a local birder who coordinates a count for a specific area. And there's also a Christmas bird count for kids, which is sort of a streamlined version designed to be more suitable for younger participants, as a traditional bird count might start from dawn to dusk. So the CBC for kids is designed to be just a little bit more family friendly, and I would encourage you to find one near you, or if you can't find one, maybe consider starting one. So how does the Christmas bird count work? Well, basically, you go out all day and you spend as much time surveying birds during daylight hours as possible. You're usually assigned a specific sector of your count area and teamed up with other birders. And you have to record your time and effort for each mode of transportation. So that's really important to allow the standardization of results across time and space. So you want to make sure you record both the time you spend looking for birds and your one-way distance traveled. So if you spend 3 hours hiking 11 kilometers by foot, and then 3.5 hours backtracking, you would consider that 6.5 hours spent looking for birds and 11 kilometers by foot. You also want to include the birds you see during count week. Those would be bird species that were observed in the week surrounding the count day, but not on the day itself. And that just reflects the fact that the count day is simply just a snapshot in time, and there are definitely species within the area that aren't going to be detected just on any given day. So there's so many different identification resources available for birds these days. Everybody has a favorite. I would encourage you to start by finding a field guide you like. I really like the Sibley Guide to Birds, which is pictured here. But the best field guide is one that you're going to use. So go to your local bookstore and browse through a few. Some are based with illustrations, others use photographs, and it really comes down to personal preference. There's a lot of apps that are also great for using in the field. I wouldn't encourage you to necessarily haul an actual physical book out in the field. Instead, spend time with your bird book when you are not birding, get familiar with the layout. And when you go out in the field, bring your binoculars with you, maybe an app, but I would actually encourage you, instead of a field guide, to maybe bring a notebook and sketch down the things that you sketch or write down the things you observe, because that way you can remember it immediately. And then reference it later and take the time to flip through a bird book and figure out maybe what you saw. And I just included a few links there to some online references, allaboutbirds.org and the Macaulay Library, which are references for general identification. And the Macaulay Library is an enormous collection of audio resources, which is really great if you're interested in birdsong. So, you see a bird. What should you pay attention to first? I think body shape is one of the most useful features for bird identification. A lot of people might think color is, exciting and interesting and important, and it is. But it's actually really hard to sometimes observe color accurately because birds are so fast moving and the lighting's often really bad. So you can actually get a pretty good sense of what you're looking at just from a general impression of the body shape and the size and shape of the bill, the bird's bill relative to other body parts and relative to other species. Also pay attention to where white areas are located on the body. They're easily visible in low lighting and often when birds are in flight or moving around. So for example, many birds of prey might have white patches on their wings or tail, and some songbirds might have white patches on their belly or their rump or their face. And these different clues can help you narrow down quite quickly what birds you might be looking at. Secondly, it's really important also to observe birds' behavior. Birds display such a huge, fascinating variety of behavior. So consider what the bird is doing. Is it single? Is it in a flock? Some species you almost only see solo or in pairs, like ravens and raptors. Other species you almost exclusively see in large flocks, like starlings and snowbuntings. So just taking kind of these social behavior considerations into account can also help narrow down what bird you're looking at. Take note what the bird is doing with his bill. Is it feeding? If so, how is it feeding? Is it pecking at wood or probing in the dirt or eating dried fruit or chasing after insects? All of these are really important clues because birds have often very specialized diets. So paying attention to their foraging behavior will also give you clues as to what bird species you're looking at. Much of the time, we observe birds in flight, perhaps when they're traveling from one tree to another or from one habitat patch to another. And fortunately, birds often have really distinctive flight styles. So I made a little illustration here of sort of a generalized woodpecker flight pattern, which is really distinctive. They have slow wing beats and a very kind of swooping flight that's quite distinctive when you've seen it a few times. And paying attention to something like that will let you narrow down at least on the family of bird you're looking at, whether you're looking at, waterfowl or a woodpecker or a small songbird. And then from there, you can look at more detailed clues like shape and color and white patches, etc., to figure out what species you're looking at. Vocalizations are also extremely helpful because you can detect them even when you can't see the bird. The nice thing about birding in winter is that it's actually a lot easier than birding in summer. First of all, there are fewer bird species around, so it just simplifies your options. And the species that are there are more visible, so they're easier to track down and they're easier to see. Additionally, in winter, birds mostly only use what we think of as calls, which are shorter versions of their songs and may only consist of a few notes, and you don't hear the more extended, complex songs that they use during their breeding season. So that simplifies trying to bird by ear, which is one of my favorite things to do. And with enough practice, you can actually walk out the door and identify most of the birds in your area without even picking up binoculars. So when you do hear a new bird song, pay attention to the rhythm and the quality of the bird song, maybe make a few notes. And then if you are able to observe the bird in person, listening to it in the field and then observing it is a great way to link up what the bird sounds like with what it looks like. And next time when you just hear the bird, you'll have a better idea of what might be in the area. Habitat is also a really useful clue since birds often have specific habitat preferences. And paying close attention to what sort of habitat the bird is in will again help you narrow down, at the very least, what sort of general family of bird you might be looking at. For example, waterfowl are usually seen on lakes and ponds. Birds of prey are usually seen in open areas, along agricultural fields or roadsides. Is the bird, near water? What sort of vegetation is the bird using? Is it, in an apple tree eating dried apples, or is it a birch tree foraging on birch seeds? All of these questions will help you narrow down what sort of bird you might be looking at. And even considering if you see a bird in a tree where it's perched is a very useful clue. Some groups of birds like finches often always perch at the top of a tree or near the edges of the branches. Other birds like woodpeckers and nuthatches are more frequently seen near the trunk and larger branches. Small songbirds like chickadees and warblers are very active and will flit quickly between branches, while other songbirds like sparrows are more typically found in bushes, shrubs, and grassy areas. Okay, so next I'm just going to go through some of the birds commonly seen in our area, what we can think of as winter residents. And these can be divided into three broad categories: waterfowl, birds of prey, and songbirds. And identifying which of these three different groups a bird falls into is a great first step in identification. So we have a couple different geese species that are present in our area. Canada goose pictured on the left and brant on the right. And note that for all of the following slides, I've only featured some of the species just for the sake of time and space. I tried to select the species that you're most likely to see, but there are certainly more that I'm not able to cover here today. Geese are often attracted to agricultural areas like cornfields, and when it comes to distinguishing between different species, overall shape is really useful for geese since they're often just observed at a distance, and they're pretty big birds, so you can get a sense of, for example, the length of the neck in proportion to the body, and things like that will help you distinguish between Canada goose and brant, which are smaller and stockier than Canada geese. Additionally, thinking about habitat, brant are usually associated with salt water or brackish water in the winter, whereas Canada geese are more commonly found kind of on agricultural lands. So I'm sure we've all seen some ducks before. We can think of ducks as being divided into two categories: dabblers versus diving ducks, and that just reflects their foraging habits. So there are distinct differences between these two groups in body shape, habitat, and behavior. Many dabbling ducks tend to have an overall more rectangular shape, whereas diving ducks sometimes have a more square shape with a longer neck relative to the body. And that's a really easy clue that's very obvious even in poor lighting and at a distance, which is often the case when, observing ducks across a lake in winter or far out on the ocean. When it comes to habitat, because dabbler ducks feed just by submerging their face and head in the water and swimming along the surface, they can only feed in shallow water. So they're usually only found along the edges of ponds and lakes, and maybe unfrozen areas near culverts during the coldest winter temperatures. Whereas diving ducks can actually completely dive between the surface of the water and forage throughout the entire water column. So they're usually found in much deeper waters, and some species are actually associated with salt water and found on the ocean. If you spend any time near the ocean this time of year, you will definitely see grebes and or loons. So they are fish and crustacean eating birds, and they're very deep divers. So you will see them in deeper water than you would typically observe dabbling and diving ducks. And grebes particularly have a very square body shape. Horned grebes have this longish neck and a cute little square head and a tiny bill, and that shape itself is very distinctive even at a distance. Whereas loons are noticeably longer bodied, sort of chunkier, and with this long, heavy bill. Additionally, grebes are usually found singly, sometimes in small groups. Loons as well, although all of these species you might observe in flocks of a few dozen when they are moving around in the fall and getting ready to migrate to the ocean from freshwater breeding areas. Birds of prey are simply fascinating, and they're not, quite as frequently observed as songbirds, but they are out there. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of extra effort to find them. So we can think of birds of prey as falling into a few different categories. We have hawks, buteo and harrier hawks, falcons, accipiter hawks, which are kind of your typical bird chasing hawks, and owls. And when you think you might be looking at a bird of prey, pay special attention to the overall shape, the wing shape if it's in flight, and the tail length relative to the body, because those clues will help you figure out which group of these different birds of prey you might be looking at. So buteo hawks are what you think of as your classic hawk. For example, the red-tailed hawk is our most common species here in Nova Scotia. They're often observed along roadsides or on fence lines and power poles. They're large and kind of chunky, with a broad, short tail. And in flight, they have a broad wingspan and soaring flight behavior. The northern harrier is found in similar habitat. Both of these species primarily prey on small mammals. However, harriers have a very different flight style. They fly very low to the ground and often have their wings held at an angled V, as you can see pictured by the bird in the middle. And they also have a very distinctive white rump patch that is present in all seasons in both males and females. And that's a really unique feature for identifying northern harriers. So our other birds of prey chase and prey on mostly small songbirds and are therefore found in slightly different habitats and have completely different flight styles. So falcons have rapid, powerful flapping flight and long tapered wings. One common falcon species that you would see here even in winter might be the merlin, which is a smaller falcon. It's dark overall and has a streaky chest and a small square head. Sharp-shinned hawks are the most common accipiter hawk, and they're similar size to a merlin, but completely different shape. If you look at the wing shape, they have rounded wings with a sort of distinct elbow at the front edge of the wing, and that's a very useful clue if you see them in flight. They also have a relatively longer tail compared to the merlin. Both of these species might target your bird feeder, unfortunately, because they're very good at cluing in on aggregations of small songbird prey. And thankfully, as part of the Christmas bird count, you are welcome to go out owling once the sun has set. Walking through your local patch of woods is a great way to find out if there's a barred owl or a great owl around. But during the daytime, if you hear or see a flock of smaller birds just making a lot of noise, acting really agitated, and maybe dive bombing and flying into a patch of dense brush, look closely, because they might actually be mobbing a bird of prey such as an owl, and that can be an indicator of the presence of owls in the daytime, because otherwise they're pretty cryptic and hard to detect. And if you are listening for owls at night, thinking about differences in the calls of barred and great horned owls can be helped by mnemonics. For example, the barred owl has a call that sort of sounds like "Who cooks for you?" Different bird guides might portray it differently. And the great horned owl's call sort of just sounds like a few repeated hoots. So they're quite distinctive and they're fairly common. So you do actually have a pretty good chance of hearing an owl if you walk around in the woods at night in winter. Okay, next I'm going to talk about passerines, which are the term used to refer to songbirds, and it's a huge group of birds. Obviously, I don't have time to cover them all, but I just picked out the most common species that you might see on a Christmas bird count. So if you have a bird feeder, you're probably familiar with blue jays. They're very social and fairly aggressive, and they will steal steal food from other birds at feeders. They're very hardy. You'll see them year round, and obviously easily identifiable by their color, as well as the fact that they have a crested head. The Canada jay is related to the blue jay, but much less common and much more of a specialist. They're typically associated with thick black spruce forest. And interestingly, they actually start nesting much earlier than most other birds in March. And they can do this through a whole set of adaptations that allow them to survive and find food in the winter. And they actually will start caching food in the fall and then return to forage on that food throughout the winter. And that those extra food stores also allow them to start breeding. And in order to be able to cache food and return to find it, Canada jays have evolved very complex spatial memories. There's a biologist at the University of Guelph who's been studying Canada jays in Algonquin Park for decades now. And if you're interested, I would encourage you to go look up his work. His research suggests that declines in Canada jays is likely due to climate change, as the milder winters that we've been experiencing cause their food caches to spoil, and that reduces their food supply and leads to years of failed reproduction. So next, let's look at woodpeckers. Our two most common species are hairy and downy woodpeckers. Unfortunately, they look almost exactly identical, even to experienced birders. Their main differences are in size. Hairy woodpeckers are about 1.5 times the size of downy woodpeckers. But useful clues are the stockier shape of the hairy woodpecker and the longer bill relative to the head, as well as the fact that downy woodpeckers have black markings on the white edges of their tail that are absent on hairy woodpeckers. And hairy woodpeckers also have a black stripe that continues uninterrupted down the back of the head. So these are all tiny clues that you can only really observe if you get a great look at them. But over time, getting a sense of the general shape of the bird will just let you distinguish between the two species. And if you're out walking in winter, you can often detect woodpeckers or the presence of woodpeckers just by hearing their tree tapping, their tapping on tree bark as you're walking through the woods if it's quiet enough. So paying attention to that will clue you into the fact that there are woodpeckers around. So next we have nuthatches and creepers, which are some of my favorite winter birds because they're tiny and cute and they're almost everywhere. Red-breasted nuthatches are very charismatic. All of these species feed by probing in and under bark on trees to consume insects. Some nuthatches will also eat seeds, so they're always found in a forested habitat. And nuthatches have a distinct foraging pattern where they will always travel upside down on tree trunks from the top to the bottom. In contrast, brown creepers, which have similar sort of appearance and foraging style, travel from the bottom of a tree trunk upwards. So even from a distance, that little behavioral trait will allow you to distinguish between these two types. Red-breasted nuthatches have a really distinctive call, and white-breasted nuthatches do as well. And they also have separate habitat preferences. White-breasted nuthatches are more frequently associated with deciduous forests, whereas red-breasted nuthatches are more frequent in coniferous forests. However, both species will definitely show up at your bird feeder. Next, I'm sure you've all seen black-capped chickadees, which are pictured here on the right. They're highly social and our most common feeder visitor. But we also have a second species present in our area, the boreal chickadee, which looks similar but has more warm beige and brown tones and a slightly different call. Now, they're strongly associated with spruce forest. If you want to see boreal chickadees on a bird count day, you usually have to go trekking across a spruce bog or through the woods. So many of our thrushes and warblers migrate in winter out of our area, but we do have a few species that stick around, notably American robins, which switch to eating mostly fruit in the winter, and therefore you can often find them, in areas that humans inhabit, backyards and landscaped areas, because they will eat the berries on different landscaping bushes and apple trees, etc. And they will also gather in very large flocks in the winter, whereas in the summer, they're usually solo and you would never see them in a large flock. But in winter, you might see 100 robins moving from different habitat patches within a landscape, which is pretty fascinating. We also have yellow-rumped warblers that will stick around even in the coldest months. They may visit feeders, but they're often associated with other songbirds, like foraging flocks of chickadees. So in winter, they're just basically trying to stay as active as possible and maybe find little thawed patches of habitat where they can still find insects to eat, but they will also switch to eating fruit. And I've even observed yellow-rumped warblers foraging in the rack line on beaches. So sometimes species will switch to foraging in completely different habitats in the winter just to be able to make ends meet. Okay, next we're going to look at sparrows, which are typically a group of birds that birders are often sort of intimidated by and might ignore just because there are so many of them. They're all mostly small and brown and hide in the bushes, but I would encourage you to spend some time learning the nuanced differences between them because they're actually really beautiful birds and they are everywhere, so you will see them. One of our most common species is the white-throated sparrow. They're common feeder visitors, and they're very identifiable using certain field marks like their bold crown stripes with yellow spots near their bill. And they also have a very plain gray belly, which differs from many other sparrows that have a streaky belly. Our most common kind of typical sparrow is the song sparrow. They're present year-round. And they have a streaky belly with a distinctive sort of darker smudgy spot in the middle. Finally, we have dark-eyed juncos, which are not quite as common as the other species, but they are present in a variety of habitats. They're a little bit more skittish and shy, so many sparrows will often pop out of a bush and sit on the tip of a branch scolding you. Dark-eyed juncos will often just fly away. Which actually gives you a chance to observe one of their distinguishing field marks. They have white edges to their tail that they flare when they fly away. So you'll just see a dark bird with white tail edges, and that's a distinguishing field mark that will clue you in on the fact that you're looking at a dark-eyed junco. Finally, we're going to look at finches. There's many finch species. I've just highlighted two here, pine siskin and American goldfinch. Siskins are streaky brown with white and yellow edges to their wing feathers, whereas goldfinches don't have that streaky appearance and just have sort of beige and gray patches, but with bold black and white patterns on their wings. Both of these species forage on weed seeds. So again, paying attention to the vegetation they're in can be really helpful here. They're often found, foraging in weedy ditches or roadsides or hedgerows. They'll also eat birch catkin seeds. So you might see them in a stand of birches. Many finch species are eruptive, meaning their movements are regular year to year, and they might be present in areas in some winters and then next year not present. And that's due to spatial variation in their food supply. Birds that eat spruce and pine and hemlock cones and many other seeds may vary in abundance depending on the particular abundance of their food source in the winter. So some years you might have large numbers of pine siskins, and next year you might not see any at all, depending on how their food source is doing locally. Okay, so next let's look at some behavioral adaptations. How do birds make it through the winter? Well, partial migration is one strategy, and that is a particular form of migration where only some individuals in a population migrate. So, for example, some species like crows, thrushes, and some woodpeckers and sparrows are partial migrants, where some members of the population from more northern regions might migrate further south, whereas others might remain in their local territories in more mild areas. And as I mentioned earlier when talking about finches, certain species might make eruptive movements and only go as far south as they need to based on their food supply. And if, say the spruce cone crop is a bust in the Midwest, you might get a lot of finches showing up in the east one winter. They might also exhibit diet switching. So birds that eat a lot of insects in the summer might switch to eating mostly fruit in the winter. And to make it through colder temperatures, birds might also exhibit different social behaviors like communal roosting. Chickadees and golden crowned kinglets pictured here will often cram into tree cavities or nesting boxes at night. And you might find over a dozen chickadees roosting together in one small cavity just to conserve body heat, which is not something that they would do during the summer. They might also use physiological adaptations to get through the winter, such as increasing their fat stores and also using their feathers to trap warm air. Birds don't actually have to increase their body temperature. They simply have to trap more warm air next to their skin, which they can do by fluffing their feathers, as seen by this fluffy black-capped chickadee in the bottom picture. Chickadees are a pretty extreme case of surviving cold temperatures. They might lose 40% of their body fat overnight just through shivering in order to maintain their body temperature. So they have to recoup that by foraging the next day. Birds can also lower their body temperature so that they can put less effort into staying warm, and they can reduce the blood flow to exposed bare areas like their legs and feet. Okay, so I said I wanted to talk about shorebirds a little bit. So for the last section here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about shorebirds and the Atlantic Canada Shorebird Survey. You might have seen this graph before. It came out as part of the State of Canada's Birds Report in 2019, and many different data sources were used to examine trends in bird populations from all different bird families over the span of years from 1970 to the present. And Christmas bird count data was very important in compiling this data and examining these trends. And note here that shorebirds pictured in the orange line have some of the most sharp declines among all of the different groups of birds. 19 of the 32 shorebird species that we see in the Maritimes are in decline. Long distance migrants in particular have the steepest declines, which suggests that there's something risky about migration. So, and just to note here, you could see in green forest birds are actually fairly stable or slightly increasing. So those would be species that you would detect on the Christmas bird count. So this is where data from different citizen science efforts can be very useful in looking at population trends over time. So in the Maritimes, we have several species at risk. We have a few species listed as special concern, including the buff-breasted sandpiper and the red-necked phalarope. And we really don't know too much about why they're declining. It might be due to conditions in their breeding grounds or their wintering grounds. The lesser yellowlegs and Hudsonian godwit are listed as threatened. And we know, at least for lesser yellowlegs, that that might be due to hunting on certain portions of more southerly parts of their migratory routes, as well as wetland loss across their breeding and migratory territory. And Hudsonian godwits are likely suffering from climate change-induced changes to breeding habitat, as well as habitat loss and disturbance on their migratory and wintering grounds. And then we have two species listed as endangered, the piping plover and the red knot. Piping plovers nest along our beaches and are subject to heavy disturbance in areas that are used by humans. And red knots stop along our coastline, along with many other shorebird species, on their way to overwintering areas in South America. So, as I mentioned, a lot of shorebirds are facing threats on both their breeding and wintering grounds, but here in Nova Scotia, we are simply just a stopover site on their fall or spring migration to different areas. So it's important that we do what we can to minimize threats to shorebirds. And here, threats mostly take place in the form of habitat loss and degradation, and most especially disturbance, which is a fairly indirect effect in that it might not directly cause a bird to die, but it might decrease what we think of as their fitness or their capacity to successfully complete migration and be able to breed the following breeding season and contribute to maintaining a healthy population. So in Nova Scotia, habitat loss is occurring as coastal wetlands and shorelines are developed. Shown here are pictures on top of coastal bog barrens being turned into peatland, which is happening in a few different areas and degrades natural wetland habitat, which aside from being an excellent carbon sink, is also important stopover habitat for some species like whimbrel. And disturbance to shorebirds is most important for the species that travel through here in large flocks and stop in very particular restricted areas like the narrow beaches of the Bay of Fundy. You might have seen the thousands and thousands of semi-palmated sandpipers that stop along the Marinas Basin, and even just the additive impacts of dogs or humans disturbing these birds while they're roosting and trying to maintain fat stores to complete migration can have effects on individual bird survival, which can then impact their breeding success and contribute to population declines. So the Atlantic Canada Shorebird Survey was initiated in 1974 by the Canadian Wildlife Service biologist Guy Morrison in an effort to develop a long-term data set. And it's part of the International Shorebird Survey, which is a global effort across multiple continents, encompassing many different local survey efforts and coordinating all of these efforts using the same protocol for data collection so that trends in species can be looked at on large spatial and temporal scales. So it's an important and actually the only source of long-term data on many of our shorebird species in Canada. And we currently have over 500 volunteers to date that have collected data at over 100 sites in the Maritimes. But many of these volunteers might not be able to visit sites as they age or sell their properties or move. So we're always looking for new volunteers, and shorebird surveys are really only most useful when they're visited consistently. So it's really important that we have sites covered year to year. So if you live near the coast and enjoy visiting the beach from July through September, I would really encourage you to consider participating. You just have to visit a shorebird migration spot, like a beach or a wetland, ideally every 10 days across the migratory period. But even if you can only make it out 2 or 3 times during the season, that's better than nothing. And there's certain bits of protocol to consider, like timing your visit around when you're most likely to see the greatest number of shorebirds. And we also encourage you to collect any data that might impact what you're observing, like the weather, whether there's human disturbance, things like that. And data entry is also really easy for this. You can enter it right into eBird, which is another online platform, which also has an app associated with it. So you can enter it in your phone from the field, or you can use a paper form and mail it to us using the address listed here. Julie Paquette is the regional shorebird biologist for Environment and Climate Change Canada. So she coordinates the Atlantic Canada Shorebird Survey. And I'm currently working to recruit new volunteers in southwestern Nova Scotia. So if you're interested in participating, I would encourage you to get in touch with her or with me, and we can send you more detailed protocol about how to participate. Okay, and then finally, I'm happy to take any questions, and I included a little slide of a quiz bird that I did explain identification to earlier. If anybody wants to take a stab at that, I can stop sharing my screen now too.
Great. Thank you, Avery. That was wonderful. So does anyone have any questions? That's good. That's a good sign. It means you have shared everything you needed to. Okay. Well, just to let everyone know, MTRI is hosting a Christmas bird count for our local area of Caledonia this coming Sunday, December 18th. So if you're not signed up or you want to learn more, you can email me and I'll include my email in the chat. And we can get you set up. And if there's no questions, Avery, I want to, you might have some questions. No, just congratulations on doing such a good job.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, there's so many resources out there. I would really encourage you to check out the online resources that I listed. Maybe consider exploring one of the apps. Again, I want to emphasize you don't have to be an expert. You can still enjoy bird watching and contribute to citizen science, even if you're just learning about the birds in your backyard.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. And I want to thank the Region of Queens for supporting MTRI's seminar series and our Lunch and Learns. So without them, we couldn't do this great work and have Avery join us. And I just see a question in the chat asking if we record our videos. Yes, this is recorded, and we are currently sharing it on our Facebook page, and we upload it to our YouTube channel as well. So if you want to get a hold of that video, you can email me in the email I just put in the chat, or just check out MTRI on our social medias. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Avery.
Thanks, Chad.